the safety of the people, I think the American government has the right to do whatever.
There's laws in place, they need to be enforced.
Every year, my insurance payments, my premiums go up.
Something's got to be done because there's a lot of people running around without health care.
Obviously, there's a lot of debate as to whether illegal aliens are a positive influence on this economy.
It's hard for us to afford everything the way it is, and then for us to have all kinds of other people to support.
But we are a country of the free, and so I think we have to be very open-minded.
I just think proper education, learning the right things.
When I look on television and I see 3 separate shooting incidents,
I think they need to get tough with it.
Straighten out the politicians.
Keep to their word, and to be honest, I think that's important.
They make a lot of decisions which sort of impact my life, impact the children's lives.
I think it's an obligation to vote. I think we all need to do that.
Welcome everyone, I'm Tom Overley. KSMQ in partnership with KTTC is pleased to present to you Election 2006, a series of conversations designed to aid you in voting in November. Our coverage represents a sampling of key races from throughout this region. It is KSMQ's plan to continue to build upon this very important service by providing even more opportunities to know and to understand the issues at hand and the people who represent you in Washington, St. Paul, your region, your hometown. We are joined by Democrat incumbent Representative Tina Liebling and her Republican opponent, Ms. Carla Nelson, both who are vying to represent you as state representative in District 30A, and I'll be asking questions compiled by our internal election team and most importantly questions submitted by you, the voters. Neither of the candidates has been provided with the questions beforehand, so let's move right into the first question, and we will begin with Carla Nelson. What are the 3 key issues in this campaign?
Well, Tom, the things that I've noticed as I've been traveling throughout the district and meeting people door to door are education. People know that we need a strong education system. It's our future. As a teacher, I know that. Secondly, people are faced with escalating health care costs, and we need to look at ways to control those costs and maintain the quality and access that we have. We have the best health care in the world in our backyard. And then thirdly, people are concerned about the economy. We need to have strong jobs. We need to be a job magnet. And we need to have good jobs, and we want to encourage growth and economic development in this region. And those seem to be the key issues in people's minds.
You're finding in this campaign. Tina, what about you?
Well, my issues are really the same issues. I think we just have a very different approach. I think there's a real question about whether we're leaving our kids the same kind of world that was given to us and giving them opportunities to succeed as Minnesota did in the past. So that's one thing. Certainly health care. I think it's way past time that everybody ought to have access to health care. Right now we don't. There are many people in the community who have no health care coverage. And then I think jobs, of course, the economy is very important because what we're seeing is a growing gap between the wealthy and the middle class. People in the middle class are really feeling under pressure, and we need to pay attention to that. Property taxes is a big part of that too.
And we will get to those issues and expand on them in just a moment. But first I want to turn to the DM&E issue. I know ultimately this will be a federal issue. But can you tell us what's your opinion on the DM&E expansion through Rochester? What should happen with that? Why don't we start with you, Carla?
Well, I think the key thing there is the loan. I think everyone should be concerned about the federal loan to this private business, one of the largest in the history. And of course the question is if it's even sustainable, or will taxpayers be on the hook? I think that the key thing is if that loan's approved, and I have arduously asked that it not be in many different realms and forms, but the point is if it's approved, it's very important that the cost to make Rochester whole again and safe is borne not by Rochester taxpayers nor by Minnesota state taxpayers. It truly ought to be a part of this loan that the DM&E is taking on and paying. So my job is to make sure that Rochester taxpayers are not on the hook, nor Minnesota taxpayers. We're hopeful for some sort of compromise that will allow this to be done safely, but at this point it's looking very bleak.
Okay, Tina?
Well, I've been opposed to this for quite some time. Very vocally opposed to the loan, as Carla says. I think this is the worst form of corporate welfare. I don't think it's an appropriate function of government to be doing this at all, frankly. And then I had raised the issue about who the owners of this company are. And now it's come out in the Post Bulletin recently that there indeed are foreign owners to this company. I think it's a real problem, and we ought to be opposing it. And I, of course, am very concerned about who ultimately will pick up the tab if it goes through.
How did the loan process, how was that approved in the first place? What happened there?
Well, this has to do with some what's gone on in Washington, and I think that it's part of a lot of what I would call kind of corrupt practices and under-the-table practices that have been going on in Washington for quite some time. And John Thune, who's a Republican senator from South Dakota, kind of slipped this provision in the middle of the night, and he's a former lobbyist for the DM&E. So there are a lot of very troublesome aspects to this.
Okay. As state lawmakers, to help prove the local economy, downtown Rochester, what can you do? What will you do, Carla?
Well, there's a couple of things we can do. When I was in the legislature 2 years ago, I authored the legislation that had some special increment districts for the downtown area to do that specific thing, which is to revitalize the downtown area. One, we need to be a welcoming community for jobs. We don't want to overregulate, we don't want to overtax. And the key thing is working in collaboration with our business partners and looking at how government can help businesses streamline and not overtax and not overregulate.
Tina.
Well, I don't think that we're overtaxed. In the last legislative session, I helped to bring to Rochester some very wonderful new investments. One is to grow the University of Minnesota in Rochester, and we succeeded in getting that funded. So that's very exciting. We brought some jobs by building some classrooms at our CTC, for example. We brought funding for biosciences, for building a new building for bioscience research and then funding bioscience research. That is all going to be very helpful in expanding and growing our economy and is going to be helpful to our whole region.
Where should funding for the University of Minnesota Rochester ultimately come from, Tina?
Well, I think it should come from the same place that the rest of the university's funding comes from ultimately. I mean, it's good to have private and public partnerships, and I think we will see a lot of that as well. But ultimately, I think that the state bears a big responsibility for funding our public colleges, and the state's really backed off on that. In fact, Carla was one of the people who voted to cut the funding for the University of Minnesota and for MNSCU, and that's caused our tuition rates to soar. So that's really the state's responsibility, and one of the things that I think we've really been backing away from is funding our public institutions so that all our kids can have opportunities for college.
Response, Carla.
Well, I was very challenged and yet honored to serve during that time of the massive budget deficit, $4.5 billion. And you know, history will record that we did do the right thing there, in that we solved that budget deficit, we turned it into a surplus, and we did not raise taxes in an already highly taxed state. And now the results are clear. Not only is the surplus on the bottom line, but tax revenues are increasing to the state by double digits, and we've righted that economy. And that's what citizens expect leaders to do. You need to have strong leadership, you need to make tough decisions, and you need to right the economy. We did that. The economy is growing now, and I think that we need to capitalize on that, and we want to encourage that.
Tuition costs for our college students on the news. I mean, we've been reporting that they just seem to go up and up and up. What can be done about that? How can we help our students afford to go to college, Tina?
Well, when we cut the funding to those institutions, the institutions have no choice but to raise the cost for students, and I just think this has been wrong. It used to be that Minnesota had in statute that we were dedicated to providing 2/3 of the cost, and we don't have that anymore, and we haven't been doing it anyway, regardless of what it says. So I think we need to fund those institutions so that everybody can have those opportunities. Also, we need to have more opportunities for students who need different kinds of training other than just college, and we've also been backing off of that commitment.
So what can we do about that?
Well, as a mother of college students, I can tell you about those high exactly, those high tuition rates. I will say it's not just our public universities that are facing increasing tuition costs. So are our private colleges. And that's largely because it's a market-driven situation. Our colleges are full, we have waiting lists, and it's very market-driven as well. But I'll tell you, there is a great difference between my opponent and I in that regard as far as college tuition. Certainly, we need to have strong public institutions, and I will continue to work for that. And we need to try and make sure that we have more access to need-based financial aid for our students. And when I served in the legislature, we put more money into need-based financial aid. That's what government ought to do. Government should not, we should not be sending those who are here illegally to college on taxpayer subsidized rates. I think that's wrong. It's a poor use of money. It's a good goal, but it's the wrong way to go. And we don't want to become a magnet for that. My opponent authored the bill that did that. It's called the DREAM Act. I would think it's more of a nightmare. We need to use our resources wisely. We need to help Minnesota students have access to higher education.
You touched on the immigration issue. What do we need to do about the number of undocumented workers here in Minnesota? Is there a solution to that?
Well, Republicans have made this a huge campaign issue, and it's interesting because they've been in control for many years now and have really done nothing about it. The problem's gotten worse and worse. And really, we do, first of all, have to recognize that this is mainly a federal problem, that we in Minnesota don't have control over our borders. The federal government has to do that. But one thing that we can do, and in fact the Bush administration has not done, is enforce the existing laws against employers who hire illegal workers and sometimes even go and recruit them to bring them here. So, but again, I think that we need to focus on what we can do to build up our state. And this issue about immigration, while it's certainly an important issue, this is not one of the things that's driving Minnesota's budget problems.
Okay. I just wanted to give you a chance to respond. I know this is a federal issue, but what can we do here in Minnesota?
There are some things we should do in this state. One thing we implemented when I was in the legislature, which is we did more frequent eligibility checks for our Health and Human Services benefits. And we have found that there were 64,000 illegal immigrants who had applied for our Health and Human Services benefits. So we need to be accountable in government. And quite frankly, the DFL did not like that proposal. And they said it was kicking people off of health care. But we have to make sure that there are eligible people on our subsidy programs. Secondly, my opponent voted against something that, again, I think would have been very helpful in this area, and that is that Minnesota have a 90-day residency period before one access our welfare. In fact, we're one of the most generous states in the region as far as welfare benefits, and she was the only legislator in southeast Minnesota, Republican or Democrat, who voted against that. Sanctuary cities. We have sanctuary cities in this state, which are cities that forbid law officers and social workers from checking immigration status. My opponent voted twice for amendments to make, one, the whole state a sanctuary city. Okay. If so, and those kind of things that are within our state control, and we need to be more responsible in that regard.
So Tina, I want to give you 1 minute to respond to that, then I want to move on to health care.
Well, she's raised a lot of issues, and I have to say this is part of the Republican plan to divide, distract, and mislead the voters. For example, this thing about welfare eligibility, I have to tell you that the fiscal note, the people who give us, the nonpartisan people who tell legislators what money will be saved, said that this would save $0. Why? Because it's been found unconstitutional in so many states that it has no chance of being upheld. So this is just another one of those divide, distract issues. And I have to say that illegal immigrants are not eligible for welfare benefits. So this has nothing to do with that. Instead of talking about the fact that they've cut funding for our colleges and that all of our students are paying more for tuition, they want to talk about a very, very small percentage of people in the state who are on welfare who may need that help for a little while. Okay. And again, divide, distract, mislead instead of talking about the real issues in the state.
Well, let's talk about a real issue, one that both of you have found talking to your constituents. What is the state's role in ensuring that health care remains affordable for everybody, Tina?
Well, I think that the state does have a huge role in that. First of all, we have to recognize that already the state pays for about half, or government pays for about half of health care. We don't have a free market system in health care. And what we've seen is that the market itself does not work in the healthcare field. It is just not a free market. So I think that we need to recognize that for the health of our state, for the economy of our state, we need to make sure that everybody has healthcare coverage. and that people who have health care coverage don't have to worry about losing it. I think one of the ways we need to do that is to start thinking of ways to unlink it from employment so that people are not forced to stay in a job or to take a certain job only because that's the only way they can get health care benefits.
And that small businesses are not saddled with that responsibility as well.
Exactly, because small businesses are disadvantaged in the marketplace because of the cost of health care. And that is not good for our economy ultimately, and it's not good for our people. Nobody should have to worry about whether they can afford to go to the doctor when they're ill.
Sure.
Well, Minnesota is one of the highest insured. It is the highest insured state as far as health insurance. We have about 92% of our people covered by health insurance. So there are some that we need to help get that coverage. But my opponent talks about moving from employer-based health insurance and she's talking about moving to government-based health insurance. And you know, I think that's a problem. We have the best health insurance, or the best health care in the country in our backyard. We have great access for the most part, but what the real concern is the rising cost. The cost is escalating greatly, and we need to look at some real cost containment measures. Things like disease prevention, disease management, encouraging people to finance and plan ahead for long-term care. That should be a part of financial planning, just like planning for your kids' college education or retirement. So we have different views here. One's talking about shifting the cost to the government, and of course there's no such thing as free government.
Sure.
And I think we need to look at some real cost containment measures. We also need to look at some consumer transparency as far as pricing. I also support not having the prescription drug ads on TV, which really drive up again the demand and cost for those expensive drugs.
Talking about prescription drugs, what should be done at the Capitol to solve this issue of the rising cost of prescription drugs?
Well, I can tell you that when I served, even during the budget deficit years, we were able to do one thing. I authored the RX Connect, which actually allowed Minnesotans to purchase their drugs from Canada. Canadian drugs are much less expensive than right here in the States, and there's no reason why our citizens shouldn't have access to that, so I was glad to author that bill. We need to look at some of the laws, quite frankly, as far as the pharmaceuticals and how they change patents, and yet there's such a small degree of change in the drugs, and I think we really need to look at that. And also I think we need to get those medical decisions about pharmaceutical needs in the doctor's office and off the TV set.
Okay, Tina.
Well, I think we need to focus on things that Minnesota actually can do something about. Drugs on TV is something, it has to do with federal law and it has to do with the First Amendment. I don't think we can do much about that in Minnesota. But I think that we could be very helpful to Minnesota consumers by bulk purchasing pharmaceuticals and acting as a purchase agent for Minnesotans so that we can then have more purchasing power with the drug companies. That's something we can do. And it's interesting to me that my opponent wants to go to Canada for drugs, and sure, I mean, that's a great short-term solution, but why are drugs cheaper in Canada? It's because the Canadian government steps in and says to the drug companies, here's the price we'll pay. So there's no reason that Minnesotans can't do the same thing, and we should be doing that. We just have to be willing to stand up to the drug companies, which I have been willing to do. I've been willing to stand up to insurance companies. I haven't really seen my opponent do that.
It's quite a battle, I can imagine, standing up against those groups. I want to give you an opportunity to ask your opponent a question. During this conversation, we're allowing our candidates to talk to each other, and so do you have a question that you have for Carla, an issue that you would like to discuss with her?
Well, I do. Carla, you have run your campaign saying that shutdowns are bad for the state. And so I wanted to ask you, during the shutdown, you wrote a letter to the Post-Bulletin actually criticizing Democrats for wanting to keep government running. So I'd like to ask you what you would have done differently.
Well, I think that the letter was truly about the many times that you and the rest of the DFL voted to continue to run our state government without a budget. And that's exactly what they're doing in Washington, D.C. That's exactly why we have such huge national deficits. And quite frankly, I'm glad that Minnesota requires that we have a balanced budget. Even though it was difficult in the greatest budget challenge we've ever had to balance that budget, we got it done. And I will say that when you quoted in the Star Trib that the reason the government shut down was because there were 3 white men in a room, I found that offensive. And I think that that's abdicating your responsibility. I think that it's everyone's responsibility up there to make sure that we have a budget and we have it on time.
Okay, Tina, I want to give you 1 minute to respond to that.
Well, of course, that misquotes. That isn't my quote, and it's taken out of context totally. And of course, the real problem is that when you shut government and start it up again, you're wasting money. This was not a game, and I was up there telling people, this is not a game. We can't shut down government. And in fact, Carla was writing to the paper saying, let government shut down. It's better if it does. And people can look that up. It's in the Post-Bulletin Archives, July 2nd of 2006.
Carla, I want to give you the same opportunity to ask a question of Tina.
Well, I never said it was good to have government shut down. I said lawmakers need to do their job. That's what you're sent there for.
All right, your question.
But the real question is, you know, there's lots of great things that we all want for Minnesota.
Sure.
And you've promised many of those, but the real question is, how do you intend to pay for them? The education promises over $5 billion alone. Your move to universal health care, $1.4 to $1.6 billion. And while it's good to make those promises, I think it's irresponsible unless you have a way to plan to pay for those. Otherwise, we're just headed for another government shutdown.
Well, it's interesting because Carla's totally made up those numbers. I have never brought out any numbers like that. And in fact, I'm not wedded to any particular plan in terms of health care or in terms of education. I just think that cutting education, as she was willing to do, instead of asking the wealthiest people in our state to pay a little more, even on a temporary basis, is the wrong way to go. In terms of health care, there is so much waste in the system, but we need to stand up to the insurance industry. Carla now is selling insurance for a living. I don't know how willing she's going to be to stand up to the insurance industry, but that's a big part of our problem. The money is there. We just need to use it.
Okay, and I want to give you a minute to respond to what Tina said.
Well, I don't sell health insurance, and one of the issues with health insurance is we've only got basically 3 providers of health insurance in the state, and we need to be more competitive in that regard. We need to have more health insurers in the state, not fewer, and we quite frankly, drive health insurers out of the state because we mandate so much. We mandate more coverages than any other state, and we're driving up the cost of health insurance. So again, I think on special interests, I'm the only candidate here that has not taken special interest money. And I think after the government shutdown, I think it was very clear that people did not want candidates wedded to special interests.
Okay. And may I just respond quickly?
Okay,
because Carla has taken so-called special interest money in the previous 2 elections. This time she's making a big deal out of I don't know what could possibly have changed, why she would have been not influenced before, but now apparently she would be.
I want to talk about some moral issues. We just have a few more minutes left in this conversation, but does a proposed amendment to ban same-sex marriage, does that need to be addressed in Minnesota? Carla?
I think we need to let the people in the state make that decision. I'm very uncomfortable having 5 or 7 judges make that type of decision. While we already have same-sex marriage already is not allowed by Minnesota law.
That's correct.
But once the Massachusetts court overturned the Massachusetts law, which is very similar to the Minnesota law, by the way, that put our law in what some perceive as jeopardy. And I think we do need to let the Minnesota citizens make that decision. And quite frankly, the legislature, well, the House has consistently voted on this, and I voted to allow the Minnesota Marriage Amendment be put forth to the voters. My opponent voted against that. On the other hand, even in the Senate, in the DFL-controlled Senate, they wouldn't even let the senators vote on it. So I think we need to it's much too important of an issue to not let the citizens have a vote.
There have been a lot of polls recently, though, that say it may be an important issue for some, but according to these polls, a great majority of Minnesotans, it is not a relevant issue. Health care, some of these other big issues are more primary issues. What do you respond to that?
Well, right. I think that really government needs to stay out of people's bedrooms and focus on issues that government really can do something about. And as far as letting people vote, you know, I don't think that in this country that it really is one of our values to have the majority vote on the rights of the minority. I just think that's wrong. And I don't think it's something that we should spend any more time on at the Minnesota legislature. I think we've spent enough time worrying about what goes on in other people's bedrooms.
Okay. How would you characterize your approach with the approach you've taken in this campaign? We've seen some negative campaign approaches. How would you characterize your campaign this year?
Well, I think it's fair in any campaign to talk about your own record and your opponent's record, and I've done that. I certainly disapprove of, I've been hit with a barrage of negative ads from the Republican Party, and in fact my opponent is repeating many of their talking points. And also I know she's had some negative ads too, and I disapprove of all of that. That's special interest money that's being spent on her behalf and on my behalf. And I think that's wrong. I think we need campaign finance reform and try to clean that up, because it really is distracting and really inexcusable.
Divisive?
Oh, I think the negative ads are terrible. I can show you, I have a stack of 12 here from the DFL party from 2004. So, and unfortunately, you're right, my Republican friends sent out 2 negative attack ads against Tina this year.
Oh, it's more than that.
I do disagree with that. I will tell you what people should look at.
Okay.
They should look at what comes in their mailbox, read the fine print, see who prints it. Things that are printed by Nelson Volunteer Committee, they can be sure they're accurate and they're true. I will say that my opponent's literature was not always that factual and true when it came from her committee as far as some of those numbers. But I do encourage people, be good readers, see who sends it out, and use your best judgment accordingly.
And I think part of that is also checking out your websites to find out more about the candidate, to find out more of where you stand on the issue. So what is your website, Carla?
www.carlanelson.org.
Okay, and Tina?
Very similar, www.tinaliebling.org, and you just have to spell it L-I-E-B-L-I-N-G.
All right, well, we appreciate both of you joining us this morning. And of course, voting is one of the key ways individuals have for staying very active in the decision-making process in this country. So we encourage you to exercise this right and privilege, and we appreciate both of you joining us today and sharing your viewpoints on these big issues. Remember, head out to the voting polls November 7th, and there is more great programming coming up on KSMQ for KSMQ and KTTC. I'm Tom Overlay.
Thank you, Tom. So, I wish we could talk for an hour.
Yes, absolutely. Did you have a response at all to what you said about some of them?
I had a lot of responses, but I know which one you need. You know, in terms of cutting people off of health care, there's never...